A businessman steps off a plane in Brussels. Expensive suit, Italian leather briefcase, confident stride. He checks into the Hilton under his own name, orders room service, makes phone calls to associates in Beirut. Security cameras capture everything. Belgian intelligence monitors his communications. He appears completely unaware that he's being watched. 3 days later, he boards a flight to Geneva, attends meetings with Swiss bankers, dines at Michelin-starred restaurants. Every movement tracked, every conversation recorded. He seems like exactly what his passport claims, a Lebanese import-export merchant conducting legitimate business across Europe. But this man is not a businessman. He's Eli Hobeika, former commander of Lebanese forces militia, architect of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and currently Mossad's most valuable double agent operating inside Hezbollah's leadership structure. And everything about his European trip, every meeting, every phone call, every documented movement is an elaborate performance designed to convince his enemies that he remains their loyal servant. This is the story of how Israeli intelligence created a perfect illusion that took 7 years to construct, involved fabricating an entire alternate life for a man, and ultimately lured his enemies into believing a lie so thoroughly that they never suspected his true allegiance until it was far too late. It reveals how deception, when executed with meticulous patience, becomes more powerful than any weapon. Understanding how this operation worked requires understanding who Eli Hobeika was and why his transformation into a double agent represented such an intelligence coup. Born in 1956 in Kliat, Lebanon, to a Christian Maronite family, Hobeika grew up during Lebanon's transformation from the Switzerland of the Middle East into a sectarian battleground. His adolescence coincided with the outbreak of civil war in 1975, when Lebanon fractured along religious and political lines, with Christian phalangists, Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, Druze militias, Palestinian refugees, and Syrian occupiers all fighting for control. Hobeika joined the Lebanese Forces, a Christian militia allied with Israel against the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Syrian forces. He rose through ranks quickly, demonstrating tactical intelligence and ruthless efficiency. By 1982, at age 26, he commanded the intelligence apparatus of the Lebanese forces under Bashir Gemayel, Israel's primary Christian ally. The September 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre defined Hobeika's international reputation. Following the assassination of Bashir Gemayel by Syrian agents, Lebanese forces militiamen entered 2 Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut, ostensibly to root out PLO terrorists. What occurred over 48 hours was systematic slaughter. Estimates range from 800 to 3,500 civilians killed, mostly women, children, and elderly. Israeli forces controlled the perimeter of the camps and provided illumination flares at night, allowing the massacre to continue. The Kahan Commission, Israel's official inquiry, found Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon indirectly responsible for failing to prevent the killings. Hobeika, who commanded the militiamen inside the camps, bore direct responsibility for ordering and supervising the operations. The massacre transformed Hobeika from an obscure militia commander into an internationally recognized war criminal. Human rights organizations documented his role meticulously. Survivors provided testimony, journalists investigated. Within Lebanon, reactions divided sharply. Christians who viewed Palestinians as threats celebrated him as a defender of their community. Muslims and leftists condemned him as a butcher. Internationally, he became synonymous with sectarian atrocity. This notoriety would later prove paradoxically useful for intelligence operations, because everyone assumed they knew exactly who Eli Hobeika was, a war criminal, a Christian extremist, a man whose ideology and actions were transparent and unchanging. That assumption would become the foundation of the illusion. By 1985, Hobeika's position within Lebanese forces deteriorated. Syria, which occupied much of Lebanon and wielded enormous influence over Lebanese politics, viewed him as a liability and potential Israeli asset. Syrian intelligence orchestrated his removal from Lebanese forces, leadership through a coup led by Samir Geagea, a rival commander who accused Hobeika of authoritarianism and incompetence. Hobeika fled to Paris, then Zurich, living in exile while plotting his return to Lebanese politics. This period of exile, while appearing as political downfall, actually represented the beginning of his transformation into a double agent. Israeli intelligence had maintained contact with him since 1982, when he served as liaison between Lebanese forces and Israeli defense forces during Lebanon's invasion. Those relationships, dormant during his command years, now activated under very different circumstances. Mossad's approach to Hobeika was calculated and patient. They did not immediately recruit him with promises of money or protection. Instead, they allowed him to experience exile, to feel the isolation of being abandoned by former allies, to recognize that his options for returning to power were limited without external support. When Mossad operatives finally made direct contact in Geneva in 1986, they offered something more valuable than cash, a path back to relevance. They proposed that Hobeika could return to Lebanon, rebuild his political base, and position himself as a reformed figure committed to Lebanese reconciliation, all while secretly providing Israel with intelligence on Hezbollah, Syrian military deployments, and Iranian activities in Lebanon. The proposal was audacious. It required Hobeika to perform a complete ideological transformation that would be convincing enough to fool Syria, Hezbollah, and eventually Iran, three intelligence services known for their sophistication and paranoia. The operation, codenamed Mirage Protocol internally, though never officially confirmed, began with carefully staged public gestures. In 1987, Hobeika gave interviews to European journalists expressing regret for the Sabra and Shatila massacre, claiming he had lost control of his militiamen and that the violence exceeded his orders. These statements, while falling short of full admission of responsibility, signaled a shift in his public posture from defiant militia commander to politician seeking redemption. Simultaneously, he began cultivating relationships with Lebanese politicians across sectarian lines, including Druze leader Walid Jumblat and Sunni officials, presenting himself as an advocate for national reconciliation. Syrian intelligence monitoring these activities interpreted them as genuine political evolution. Hobeika's willingness to criticize Israeli policies in subsequent interviews reinforced the perception that he was distancing himself from his former Israeli allies. The key to the illusion's success was that it developed slowly, over years rather than months, allowing each stage to be scrutinized and verified by suspicious observers. In 1988, Hobeika returned to Lebanon with Syrian approval, joining a pro-Syrian coalition government as a minister without portfolio. This return, facilitated by Syrian intelligence who believed they had successfully co-opted a former Israeli asset, placed Hobeika in position to access information Israel desperately needed. He began providing regular intelligence to Mossad through clandestine meetings in Cyprus and Athens, using his government position to obtain details on Hezbollah operations, Syrian military dispositions, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard activities in the Bekaa Valley. The intelligence was highly specific: names of operatives, locations of weapons caches, planned attacks against Israeli targets, internal disputes within Hezbollah leadership. Israeli military operations throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s demonstrated uncanny precision, striking targets that had been carefully concealed, intercepting weapons shipments that should have been secret, and neutralizing threats before they materialized. Syrian and Hezbollah counterintelligence services naturally suspected a mole within their organizations, but their investigations focused on lower-level operatives and technical compromises of communication systems. Hobeika, by virtue of his public political role and his history of conflict with Israel, remained above suspicion. His occasional public criticisms of Israeli policies, his votes in parliament against normalizing relations with Israel, and his participation in pro-Palestinian demonstrations all reinforced his cover. The genius of the operation lay in understanding that the best cover for a double agent is not complete invisibility, but rather highly visible consistency with expected behavior. Everyone knew Hobeika as an anti-Palestinian, pro-Christian militia commander who had worked with Israel in the past. His apparent transformation into a pro-Syrian, pan-Lebanese politician seemed like a pragmatic adaptation to changed circumstances, not evidence of continued Israeli intelligence. The intelligence Hobeika provided proved invaluable during a critical period of Israeli-Hezbollah conflict. In 1989, he alerted Mossad to a planned Hezbollah operation targeting Israeli tourists in Europe, allowing security services to disrupt the plot before execution. In 1990, he provided details on Iranian weapons shipments transiting Syria en route to Hezbollah, enabling Israel to coordinate with European authorities to intercept the cargo. In 1992, he identified the location of a senior Hezbollah military commander, Sheikh Abbas Musawi, allowing Israel to assassinate him via helicopter strike. Each successful operation deepened suspicions within Hezbollah that they had a serious security breach, but also each successful operation reinforced Hobeika's value to Mossad, justifying the enormous effort required to maintain his cover. The logistical challenges of running a high-level double agent in hostile territory were immense. Communication could not occur through normal diplomatic or intelligence channels, which were monitored by Lebanese, Syrian, and Hezbollah services. Mossad established an elaborate network of cutouts and dead drops. Hobeika would travel regularly to Cyprus, ostensibly for medical treatments or business meetings, where he would meet handlers in safe houses arranged through front companies. He used encrypted satellite phones purchased through Lebanese diaspora contacts in South America, devices that appeared in Lebanese telecommunications records as belonging to businessmen with no connection to Hobeika. Documents were photographed using miniature cameras disguised as luxury pens or watches, technology that allowed him to copy files in his government office without arousing suspicion. The financial arrangements were equally complex. Mossad paid Hobeika substantial sums, but the money could not appear in Lebanese bank accounts without triggering inquiries. Instead, funds were deposited in Swiss and Liechtenstein accounts held under false names, accessible only through specific protocols that left no trace connecting the accounts to either Hobeika or Israeli intelligence. By 1995, Hobeika had become so deeply embedded within Lebanese political establishment that he was elected to parliament representing the Matan district, a Christian area northeast of Beirut. His parliamentary position provided even greater access to sensitive information, as he served on security and defense committees that reviewed classified briefings on threats facing Lebanon. Hezbollah, having evolved from pure militia into a political party with parliamentary representation alongside its military wing, now sat in the same legislature as Hobeika. He interacted regularly with Hezbollah parliamentarians, maintaining cordial relationships that seemed entirely natural given Lebanon's sectarian political system that required cooperation across factional lines. Those relationships provided opportunities to gather intelligence through casual conversations, observing who met with whom, noting which Hezbollah figures seemed to wield actual authority versus those who were merely public faces. The most audacious aspect of the operation occurred in 1998, when Hezbollah's leadership, seeking to diversify their political alliances and demonstrate their evolution beyond sectarian militia, approached Hobeika to serve as informal mediator between Hezbollah and Christian political factions. The role seemed logical. Hobeika's credentials as former militia commander gave him credibility with Christian groups, while his pro-Syrian stance and parliamentary cooperation with Hezbollah signaled his acceptance of Hezbollah's permanent place in Lebanese political landscape. Syrian intelligence, which orchestrated the outreach, viewed Hobeika as their asset being leveraged to stabilize Lebanese politics. Hezbollah viewed him as a pragmatic politician who could help them navigate Christian political networks. Only Mossad understood the true significance. The double agent had now been invited directly into Hezbollah's political strategy sessions. The mediation role provided unprecedented intelligence access. Hobeika attended meetings with senior Hezbollah political officials, discussing their strategic calculations, their relationship with Iran, their assessment of Israeli threats, and their internal debates about balancing military operations against political participation. He learned which Hezbollah leaders favored continued armed resistance versus those who preferred focusing on political and social service activities. He identified ideological fault lines between Hezbollah's Shiite religious identity and its Lebanese nationalist political messaging. He discovered how decisions were actually made within the organization, which appeared monolithic from outside but internally involved complex consultations between religious scholars, military commanders, and political strategists. Every detail was reported to Mossad, providing insights into Hezbollah's thinking that no amount of technical surveillance could reveal. The illusion's maintenance required constant reinforcement. Hobeika could not simply provide intelligence and remain passive politically. He had to continue behaving exactly as a genuine pro-Syrian, Hezbollah cooperating politician would behave. When Israel conducted operations in Lebanon, he publicly condemned them. When Hezbollah attacked Israeli targets, he remained conspicuously silent or offered carefully ambiguous statements that could be interpreted as tacit approval. When Western governments criticized Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, he defended Lebanese resistance as legitimate defense of sovereignty. His voting record in parliament aligned consistently with pro-Syrian, pro-Hezbollah positions. His public speeches emphasized Lebanese unity, resistance against Israeli occupation, and gratitude to Syria for maintaining stability. Every gesture, every statement, every vote reinforced the narrative that Eli Hobeika had genuinely transformed from Israeli-allied militia commander to Syrian-aligned Lebanese politician. Behind the scenes, Israeli intelligence used Hobeika's information to conduct operations carefully calibrated to avoid exposing their source. When Hobeika identified a Hezbollah operative planning an attack, Israel would not immediately arrest that specific individual, which would signal a security breach. Instead, they would enhance general security measures at likely targets, or quietly provide intelligence to European services, who would make arrests that appeared unrelated to the original plot. When Hobeika revealed locations of weapons caches, Israel would not immediately strike those locations, but would wait weeks or months, then conduct broader operations that hit multiple targets including the cache, but providing no indication which target was the primary objective. The operational discipline required enormous patience, accepting that some intelligence could not be acted upon at all because doing so would risk compromising the source. Syrian intelligence, despite their sophistication, never penetrated the deception. Part of this failure resulted from cognitive bias. They had recruited Hobeika in 1987, orchestrated his return to Lebanon, and maintained regular contact with him through their station in Beirut. From their perspective, Hobeika was their asset, someone they had successfully turned from Israeli ally to Syrian servant. The possibility that he might simultaneously be serving Israeli intelligence seemed contradicted by his reliable behavior, his political positions, and the risks such double dealing would entail. Syrian intelligence officers pride themselves on their professional competence and their understanding of human motivation. The idea that they could be systematically deceived for over a decade by someone they believed they controlled was psychologically difficult to accept, so warning signs that might have triggered investigation were instead rationalized away as anomalies or coincidences, Hezbollah's failure to detect. Hobeika's true allegiance is more interesting because their counterintelligence services had correctly identified that Israel was receiving detailed information about their operations from someone with access to high-level planning. Internal security reviews conducted in 1993 and 1997 documented patterns of compromised operations that suggested a penetration at senior levels. Suspects were investigated, subjected to surveillance, interrogated, and in several cases assassinated based on circumstantial evidence. Hobeika's name appeared on lists of individuals with relevant access, but he was consistently eliminated from suspicion because his public political position made him too visible to function as a covert intelligence source. Hezbollah's counterintelligence officers, trained by Iranian and Syrian services, operated under the assumption that effective spies maintain low profiles, avoid public attention, and minimize their exposure to scrutiny. Hobeika, as a parliamentarian who gave speeches, attended public events, and was frequently photographed with other politicians, seemed completely inconsistent with tradecraft principles. The assumption that visibility equals transparency proved catastrophically wrong. The operation's success created its own risks. The more valuable Hobeika proved as an intelligence source, the more tempting it became for Mossad to act on his information immediately rather than waiting for operationally secure timing. Israeli military and intelligence officials debated internally about the appropriate balance between exploiting current intelligence and protecting long-term access. Some argued that Hobeika's position was inherently unstable, that Lebanese politics could shift unpredictably, and that they should maximize intelligence extraction while possible. Others contended that patience had built the illusion and only continued patience would sustain it. The debate reflected fundamental tensions in intelligence work between immediate operational gains and strategic patience. Ultimately, Mossad's leadership maintained discipline, recognizing that a long-term source at Hobeika's level was too valuable to risk through precipitous action. By 2001, Hobeika's intelligence value actually increased due to regional developments. The September 11th attacks and subsequent U.S. invasion of Afghanistan intensified American focus on Middle Eastern terrorism, including Hezbollah's relationship with Iran and Syria. Israel, seeking to align its security concerns with American counterterrorism priorities, needed detailed intelligence on Hezbollah's connections to Iranian Revolutionary Guards and their potential involvement in planning attacks beyond Lebanon. Hobeika's position provided exactly this intelligence. He reported on meetings between Hezbollah officials and Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers visiting Beirut, identified which Hezbollah operatives had received training in Iran, and described internal debates within Hezbollah about whether to expand operations beyond Israeli targets to include American interests. This information was shared selectively with U.S. intelligence services, enhancing Israel's value as a strategic partner while carefully protecting the source. The endgame began in late 2001 when Hobeika made a catastrophic operational error. During a meeting with Mossad handlers in Cyprus, he mentioned that he had been approached by an international tribunal investigating the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Belgian prosecutors, under universal jurisdiction statutes allowing prosecution of war crimes regardless of where they occurred, were building a case against Ariel Sharon, then Israeli Prime Minister, and were seeking testimony from witnesses with direct knowledge of events. Hobeika, as the Lebanese forces commander who ordered militiamen into the camps, was obviously a key potential witness. The tribunal investigators offered him immunity from prosecution in exchange for detailed testimony about coordination with Israeli forces. Hobeika told his Mossad handlers that he was considering cooperating with the tribunal, believing that providing testimony against Sharon would further solidify his cover as someone definitively separated from Israeli intelligence. Mossad's response was swift and unambiguous. They ordered Hobeika to refuse any contact with the tribunal. The concern was not primarily about protecting Sharon, who had retired from active military service years earlier, but about the interrogation process. International prosecutors would examine every aspect of Hobeika's life since 1982, including his finances, his travels, his relationships, his communications. The forensic accounting and surveillance review necessary for tribunal preparation would almost certainly expose anomalies that could not be easily explained. Swiss bank accounts with no clear legitimate source, meetings in Cyprus that had no apparent business purpose, encrypted communications devices that seemed excessive for a Lebanese parliamentarian. All of these would attract questions, even if investigators did not initially suspect Israeli intelligence connections. Their inquiries could trigger parallel investigations by Lebanese, Syrian, or Hezbollah services who would be monitoring the tribunal process. The risk was existential. After 15 years of meticulous operational security, tribunal cooperation could unravel everything. Hobeika, however, believed he could manage the risk. He had successfully maintained his cover for over a decade, deceiving multiple sophisticated intelligence services, and saw tribunal cooperation as the ultimate confirmation of his transformation from Israeli ally to independent Lebanese politician willing to testify against Israeli leadership. His confidence, which had enabled him to function effectively under enormous pressure, now became a liability. He underestimated both the thoroughness of international prosecutors and the ruthlessness of intelligence services, Israeli and others, who had stakes in preventing his testimony. In January 2002, Hobeika informed Mossad that he would cooperate with the tribunal despite their objections. He assured them he could compartmentalize his testimony, focusing only on events from 1982, and that he had prepared explanations for any financial or communication irregularities that might arise. Mossad's response was bureaucratic and chilling. They closed his file, terminated communication, and activated protocols for protecting operational security when a source was compromised. On January 24, 2002, at approximately 9:30 a.m., Eli Hobeika left his apartment in the Hazmi neighborhood of Beirut, walking toward his armored Mercedes sedan accompanied by 3 bodyguards. He had meetings scheduled with political associates to discuss parliamentary business. Security procedures were routine. Bodyguards checked the vehicle exterior for explosive devices, a standard precaution in Beirut where car bombs remained common. They found nothing suspicious. Hobeika entered the rear seat. His driver started the engine. As the Mercedes pulled away from the curb, a massive explosion obliterated the vehicle. The blast, later determined to be approximately 150 kilograms of military-grade explosives, was so powerful it created a crater in the street and damaged buildings 50 meters away. Hobeika and his 3 bodyguards died instantly. Forensic investigation revealed the bomb had been placed in a parked car adjacent to Hobeika's vehicle, detonated remotely as his Mercedes passed. The sophistication of the operation, the timing precision, and the explosive quantity all indicated professional intelligence service execution rather than typical criminal or militia violence. Lebanese authorities immediately launched an investigation, but the political sensitivities were paralyzing. 4 entities had clear motives for assassinating Hobeika. Syria, if they had discovered his relationship with Israel, would eliminate him to protect their intelligence operations and send a message about betrayal. Hezbollah, if they had identified him as the source of intelligence leaks, would kill him both for revenge and operational security. Israel, if they believed he was about to expose their intelligence operations through tribunal testimony, might eliminate him to prevent disclosure. Lebanese political rivals, of which Hobeika had accumulated many through decades of sectarian conflict, could have arranged his killing for purely domestic political reasons. The investigation, predictably, concluded with no definitive attribution. Lebanese prosecutors cited lack of evidence, destroyed crime scene, and political constraints preventing thorough inquiry. The assassination remained officially unsolved, though everyone understood that unsolved meant diplomatically inconvenient to solve. The timing, coming just weeks before Hobeika was scheduled to provide preliminary testimony to Belgian prosecutors, suggested tribunal-related motives. International human rights organizations immediately alleged Israeli involvement, arguing that only Israel had sufficient motive to prevent Hobeika's testimony about Sabra and Shatila. Israeli government officials denied responsibility, with foreign ministry spokesmen suggesting that Syria or Hezbollah were more likely culprits given Hobeika's complicated history with various Lebanese factions. The denials were pro forma and unconvincing. Whether Israel actually ordered the assassination remains classified information, but operational logic suggests they had overwhelming motive and demonstrated capability. From Mossad's perspective, allowing Hobeika to testify presented unacceptable risks to ongoing operations. Intelligence methods, and potentially other sources whose security depended on Hobeika's secrets remaining buried. The alternative theory, that Syria or Hezbollah assassinated Hobeika after finally discovering his double-agent status, is equally plausible. If either service had penetrated Israeli communications or developed human sources within Mossad, they might have learned about Hobeika's true allegiance in late 2001 or early 2002. The assassination would then represent both punishment for betrayal and elimination of someone whose continued existence threatened to expose how thoroughly they had been deceived. The fact that no Syrian or Hezbollah officials ever publicly acknowledged discovering Hobeika as an Israeli agent suggests either they never learned the truth, or they chose to keep the humiliating discovery secret rather than admit they had been systematically fooled for 15 years. Intelligence services rarely publicize their failures, preferring to eliminate problems quietly and maintain facades of competence. The third possibility, rarely discussed but operationally logical, is that multiple services coordinated Hobeika's assassination. If both Israeli intelligence and Syrian Hezbollah services had independently concluded that Hobeika needed to die, they might have established back-channel communication to arrange his elimination in a way that served everyone's interests. Israel would prevent tribunal testimony. Syria and Hezbollah would eliminate a discovered traitor, and a shared responsibility would ensure no single party bore the diplomatic consequences. Such arrangements, while seeming conspiratorial, occasionally occur when intelligence services find their interests temporarily aligned despite broader strategic opposition. The absence of any serious Lebanese investigation and the rapid closure of the case supports this interpretation, suggesting that multiple regional powers preferred Hobeika's secrets die with him rather than risk exposure through thorough investigation. The operation's legacy within intelligence communities is studied intensively but rarely discussed publicly. Mirage Protocol, if that indeed was its designation, represents nearly perfect execution of long-term deception operation. The operational lessons are clear. The best cover for a double agent is not invisibility but highly visible consistency with expected behavior. Ideological transformation, if developed gradually with verifiable actions, can be more convincing than maintained ideological consistency. And the most valuable intelligence often comes from sources whose public positions seem completely inconsistent with covert intelligence work. Training materials for intelligence officers at Mossad, CIA, MI6, and other services almost certainly include Hobeika case study, though the details remain classified and the true depth of his cooperation may never be fully disclosed. For Hezbollah, if they indeed discovered Hobeika's betrayal, the operational implications were devastating. 15 years of compromised operations, dozens of killed operatives, intercepted weapons shipments, and disrupted attacks all had to be re-evaluated, understanding that Israel possessed detailed intelligence about internal plans and thinking. The security overhaul required was massive, involving personnel changes, communication protocol revisions, and fundamental reassessment of who could be trusted. Some analysts credit Hezbollah's increasing operational effectiveness after 2002, particularly during the 2006 Lebanon War when they fought Israeli defense forces to standstill, to lessons learned from discovering and closing the Hobeika penetration. If so, the double-agent operations exposure paradoxically strengthened Hezbollah by forcing them to address security vulnerabilities they might otherwise have ignored. The moral ambiguity of the operation is profound and disturbing. Eli Hobeika was not a sympathetic figure. His role in the Sabra and Shatila massacre made him complicit in war crimes. His subsequent political career involved continued participation in Lebanon's corrupt and violent sectarian system, yet his transformation into double agent, regardless of his motives, represented a choice to provide intelligence that prevented attacks, saved lives, and gave Israeli military and civilians advance warning of threats. The operation's success meant that someone responsible for killing hundreds of Palestinians in 1982 ended up saving potentially hundreds of Israeli lives through intelligence he provided over 15 years. The ethical calculation is impossible to resolve cleanly. Can intelligence cooperation redeem past atrocities? Does preventing future violence compensate for past crimes? These questions have no satisfying answers. Only the uncomfortable recognition that intelligence work often involves relationships with morally compromised individuals. The extent to which Hobeika's cooperation was motivated by ideology versus pragmatism versus coercion remains debated. Some analysts argue he genuinely ideologically shifted, recognizing that Lebanon's future required accepting Israeli existence and that Christian minorities needed security arrangements with Israel to survive in majority Muslim region. Others contend his cooperation was purely transactional, exchanging intelligence for Israeli protection and financial support that allowed him to maintain political position. A third interpretation suggests Mossad held compromising information about his role in Sabra and Shatila, perhaps photographic or documentary evidence beyond what was publicly known, and threatened prosecution at international tribunals unless he cooperated. The truth likely involves elements of all three motivations. Humans rarely act from single motives, especially in situations requiring sustained commitment over years under enormous pressure. The operation's exposure, whether through tribunal investigation, threat, or counterintelligence discovery, reveals the fundamental instability of long-term double-agent operations. The longer such operations run, the more opportunities arise for exposure through accumulated small errors, changed circumstances, or simple bad luck. Hobeika maintained operational security for 15 years, an extraordinary achievement, but ultimately could not sustain the deception indefinitely. The mechanics of how Hobeika actually passed intelligence to his handlers reveal the extraordinary operational sophistication required to sustain such a long-term operation. Dead drops, the classic spy-craft technique of leaving materials at predetermined locations for later retrieval, proved too risky in Lebanon's paranoid security environment where Syrian and Hezbollah surveillance teams constantly monitored suspicious behavior. Instead, Mossad developed a network of cutouts, intermediaries who appeared to have legitimate business or personal relationships with Hobeika, but who actually functioned as intelligence conduits. One key cutout was a Lebanese Christian businessman operating import-export operations between Beirut and Cyprus. He traveled regularly for documented commercial purposes, visiting Hobeika's office to discuss legitimate business matters while simultaneously receiving encrypted data cards disguised as commercial product samples. Another cutout was a Greek Orthodox priest serving Lebanese diaspora communities who traveled between Beirut, Athens, and Jerusalem for religious duties. His meetings with Hobeika appeared as pastoral counseling sessions, but actually involved detailed debriefings on recent intelligence developments. The communication devices Hobeika used evolved throughout the operation as technology advanced and counterintelligence capabilities improved. In the late 1980s, encrypted satellite phones were rare enough that possession alone would trigger suspicion. Mossad instead provided him with modified commercial mobile phones that contained hidden secondary transmission capabilities. The phones functioned normally for routine calls, generating standard telecommunications metadata that Lebanese services could monitor, but contained encrypted burst transmission modes activated by specific button sequences that could send compressed data files during brief windows when surveillance might be less attentive. By the mid-1990s, as encrypted communications became more common for businesses and politicians concerned about privacy, Hobeika could use more sophisticated devices without arousing as much suspicion, though he still maintained multiple phones for different purposes, separating legitimate political communications from intelligence transmissions. The financial architecture supporting the operation was equally complex. Hobeika received substantial payments for his intelligence cooperation, amounts that ultimately totaled millions of dollars over 15 years. These funds could not simply be deposited in Lebanese bank accounts without triggering money laundering investigations or tax inquiries about the source of income. Mossad established an elaborate system of offshore accounts, front companies, and investment vehicles that made the money appear as legitimate business income. A Cypriot shipping company, ostensibly owned by Lebanese diaspora investors, employed Hobeika as a consultant, paying him monthly fees that were actually intelligence compensation disguised as business income. A Swiss investment fund, managed through Liechtenstein trustees, showed Hobeika as a minority investor receiving dividend payments that were actually intelligence payments. The documentation supporting these arrangements was meticulous, with forged contracts, fabricated business correspondence, and constructed paper trails that would withstand casual scrutiny while providing plausible explanations for Hobeika's unexplained wealth. The psychological pressures Hobeika endured throughout 15 years of double-agent work were immense and carefully managed by his Mossad handlers. Living constantly under the threat of discovery, maintaining perfect consistency in his public role while secretly betraying those who trusted him, and knowing that any mistake could result in torture and execution, created sustained stress that few individuals could tolerate long-term. Mossad provided regular psychological support through handlers trained in managing agent stress, offering validation of his importance, reinforcing his ideological justifications for cooperation, and providing emotional connection that mitigated his isolation. The handlers understood that Hobeika could not discuss his double-agent role with anyone else, could not seek validation or emotional support from friends or family, and needed his Mossad contacts to serve as the only people who knew his true situation and could acknowledge the sacrifices he was making. The operational protocols for meetings between Hobeika and his handlers were rigid and constantly varied to prevent pattern recognition. Meetings never occurred at the same location twice consecutively. The intervals between meetings varied, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 3 months, making the timing unpredictable. The meeting locations were selected based on Hobeika's legitimate travel schedule, coordinated with business trips or political visits that provided natural cover. When Hobeika traveled to Cyprus for medical treatment, a genuine need related to stress-induced health problems, his handlers would arrange meetings at medical facilities, hotels, or restaurants that Hobeika would naturally visit. When he traveled to European capitals for political conferences, meetings would occur in the lobbies of venues where he had legitimate reasons to be present. The preparation for each meeting involved surveillance detection routes, counter-surveillance teams ensuring Hobeika was not being followed, and backup plans for aborting meetings if any anomalies were detected. The intelligence Hobeika provided was not just tactical information about specific operations, but strategic insights into how Hezbollah thought about long-term objectives, internal debates, and decision-making processes. He reported on discussions within Hezbollah leadership about whether to prioritize military operations against Israel or political development within Lebanon. He described ideological tensions between younger Hezbollah members who had grown up during Israeli occupation and viewed armed resistance as essential to their identity, and older leaders who recognized that sustained military conflict was depleting resources that could be used for social services and political organizing. He identified which Hezbollah officials maintained close relationships with Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors and which were more independent, pursuing distinctly Lebanese rather than Iranian-directed objectives. These strategic insights allowed Israeli intelligence to understand not just what Hezbollah was planning, but why they were planning it, enabling more effective counter-strategies. One particularly valuable intelligence stream concerned Hezbollah's relationship with Iranian weapons development programs. Hobeika reported on visits by Iranian engineers to Lebanon, describing their work helping Hezbollah develop indigenous rocket production capabilities. He identified factories in the Bekaa Valley where rockets were being assembled using Iranian-supplied components. He provided technical specifications for improved rocket designs that extended range and payload capacity, allowing Israeli military to assess the threat and develop appropriate countermeasures. He reported on Iranian training programs teaching Hezbollah operatives advanced tactics including urban warfare, tunnel construction, and anti-armor operations. This information proved critical during the 2006 Lebanon War, when Israeli forces encountered far more sophisticated Hezbollah military capabilities than expected, but at least had some advance warning that allowed them to adjust tactics. The deception extended beyond just Hobeika's political activities to include his entire social and family life. His wife, whom he married in 1990, apparently had no knowledge of his intelligence cooperation. He maintained completely separate personal and operational lives, compartmentalizing so thoroughly that his wife perceived him only as a Lebanese politician struggling with the normal stresses of parliamentary life and dealing with legacies of his militia past. His children, born in the early 1990s, grew up viewing their father as a controversial but principled political figure working for Lebanese reconciliation. The burden of deceiving not just enemies but family created additional psychological stress, as Hobeika could never share his true situation with those closest to him. Mossad handlers considered informing his wife to provide him with emotional support, but decided the security risks were too great. If the marriage deteriorated or if she was interrogated by Syrian or Hezbollah services, any knowledge she possessed could compromise the entire operation. The tribunal investigation represented a random external factor that neither he nor his handlers anticipated when beginning cooperation in 1986. No amount of planning could account for Belgian prosecutors deciding in 2001 to pursue universal jurisdiction war crimes cases. The unpredictability of such external events is why intelligence services generally prefer technical collection methods like signals intelligence over human sources, despite human sources often providing more valuable information. The Belgian investigation, formally launched in 2001 under Belgium's Universal Jurisdiction Statute, allowing prosecution of war crimes regardless of where they occurred, initially focused on Ariel Sharon's role as Israeli defense minister during the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Prosecutors sought to establish whether Sharon had knowledge that Lebanese forces militiamen would commit atrocities if allowed into the refugee camps, and whether his decision to facilitate their entry made him complicit in war crimes. The investigation required testimony from everyone involved in the operation, including Lebanese forces commanders who actually ordered and supervised the killings. Hobeika, as the highest-ranking surviving commander who had directly controlled forces inside the camps, was the most critical potential witness. His testimony could either corroborate or contradict Sharon's claims that he had no knowledge militiamen would target civilians. The prosecutor's approach to Hobeika was careful and professional. They recognized his complicated position. He was a sitting member of Lebanese parliament. He had been publicly accused of war crimes himself, and his testimony could expose him to prosecution. They offered him limited immunity, protecting him from prosecution for testimony he provided, while reserving the right to pursue charges based on independent evidence. They proposed conducting initial interviews in neutral locations, possibly Switzerland or Cyprus, to avoid requiring him to travel to Belgium where he might face arrest. They promised confidentiality during the investigation phase, not publicly disclosing his cooperation until formal charges were filed. These assurances were designed to overcome his reluctance to testify, but they also meant that once he began cooperating, he would be locked into a process that would examine every detail of his life. Mossad's threat assessment concluded that the tribunal investigation posed unacceptable risks on multiple levels. The most immediate concern was that forensic accounting required for war crimes prosecution would expose Hobeika's offshore financial accounts. Prosecutors would trace every payment he received since 1982, seeking to establish his financial motivations and his capacity to organize systematic killings. Swiss and Liechtenstein authorities, under pressure to cooperate with war crimes investigations, would likely provide access to banking records that had previously been protected. Once the accounts were exposed, Lebanese Syrian or Hezbollah services monitoring the tribunal proceedings would demand explanations for the sources of the funds. Hobeika's cover stories about consulting income and investment returns would not withstand serious scrutiny, particularly when investigators noticed that payment patterns corresponded with his travels to Cyprus and his provision of intelligence that led to successful Israeli operations. The second concern was that intensive investigation of his movements since 1986 would reveal patterns inconsistent with his cover role. Travel records would show him visiting Cyprus with inexplicable frequency, meeting in hotels where he had no documented business, and traveling to locations that made sense only if he was coordinating with intelligence handlers. Telecommunications records, if obtained by prosecutors, might reveal encrypted phone usage patterns that suggested clandestine communications. Even if none of this evidence definitively proved intelligence cooperation, it would create enough anomalies to trigger parallel investigations by services already suspicious about intelligence leaks. The tribunal investigation would essentially perform the counterintelligence work that Syrian and Hezbollah services had failed to conduct thoroughly during previous years. The third concern was that Hobeika himself, under pressure of detailed interrogation by professional prosecutors, might make statements that inadvertently revealed his intelligence cooperation. He had maintained his cover successfully for 15 years when interactions were brief and he controlled the narrative, but hours of prosecutorial questioning using techniques designed to elicit detailed, truthful testimony about past events would be far more challenging. Prosecutors would press him to explain contradictions between his public statements and his actual actions, to account for his finances and travels, to describe his relationships with Syrian and Israeli officials. Even if he had perfect operational discipline, the cumulative pressure might cause him to make statements that later analysis would reveal as inconsistent with his cover story. Mossad's directive to Hobeika refusing any tribunal cooperation was not a suggestion but an absolute order backed by explicit threats. His handlers informed him that if he testified, Israel would provide information to Syrian and Hezbollah services documenting his intelligence cooperation, essentially signing his death warrant to prevent his testimony from exposing Israeli intelligence operations. The threat was credible because Israel had precedent for sacrificing sources to protect larger operational equities. The message was clear: his value as a long-term intelligence source was finite, and if he chose to cooperate with prosecutors, Israel would treat him as an operational liability to be eliminated rather than an asset to be protected. Hobeika's decision to proceed with tribunal cooperation despite this threat reveals either spectacular courage or spectacular misjudgment. He believed, apparently, that after 15 years of successfully deceiving multiple intelligence services, he could manage one more deception, convincing prosecutors that he was a reformed war criminal willing to testify truthfully while simultaneously protecting the secrets that would expose his intelligence role. He underestimated the forensic capabilities of modern war crimes investigations and overestimated his ability to control information flow once he entered the legal process. His confidence, which had enabled his double-agent success, became the vulnerability that precipitated his downfall. The assassination planning likely began within days of Hobeika informing his handlers he would cooperate with the tribunal. Whether Israeli intelligence conducted the operation themselves, provided intelligence to enable Syrian or Hezbollah services to eliminate him, or simply leaked information that would trigger his enemies to act, remains classified. The operational characteristics of the assassination, particularly the use of massive car bomb rather than more subtle methods like poison or staged accident, suggest involvement by services accustomed to that methodology, which could be Hezbollah, Syrian intelligence, or Israeli operations deliberately mimicking their style to create plausible deniability. The bomb's size, at least 150 kilograms of military-grade explosive, was excessive for simply killing one man even with his armored vehicle and bodyguards. That overkill suggested either ensuring absolutely certain death or sending a message about the consequences of betrayal. The timing was surgical, eliminating Hobeika exactly 3 weeks before his scheduled preliminary interview with Belgian prosecutors. The narrow window between his decision to cooperate and his assassination suggests either that intelligence services monitoring his communications intercepted his arrangements with prosecutors, or that someone involved in scheduling the interviews betrayed the information. Lebanese judicial system, notorious for leaking sensitive information, provided multiple opportunities for intelligence services to learn about Hobeika's cooperation plans. Syrian intelligence maintained sources throughout Lebanese government and likely knew within days of prosecutors contacting him. Hezbollah's political intelligence network would have similarly detected his communications with European judicial authorities. Israeli intelligence, through signals intercepts or human sources within Lebanese government, would have tracked the tribunal's approach to potential witnesses. The forensic investigation of the assassination was perfunctory and deliberately incomplete. Lebanese authorities collected physical evidence from the bomb site, interviewed witnesses who saw the attack, and examined the wreckage of Hobeika's Mercedes and the detonating vehicle. But they conducted no serious investigation into who orchestrated the operation, who prepared the bomb, who conducted surveillance to establish Hobeika's movement patterns, or who triggered the detonation. The investigation avoided all the questions whose answers would implicate powerful regional intelligence services. The official conclusion, announced 3 months after the assassination, attributed the attack to unknown perpetrators using professional methods, and closed the case without identifying suspects. The message was clear. Lebanese authorities had no intention of investigating crimes committed by intelligence services who could retaliate against anyone pursuing inconvenient truths. The impact on the Belgian tribunal investigation was immediate and chilling. With their key witness dead and Lebanese authorities uncooperative about investigating his murder, prosecutors lost their most direct source of evidence about Sharon's knowledge and intentions during the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Other potential witnesses, seeing what happened to Hobeika, refused cooperation with investigators. The case effectively died with him, formally suspended in 2003 when Belgian Parliament amended the Universal Jurisdiction Statute under pressure from Israeli and American governments who argued that Belgium was using judicial processes to conduct political prosecutions. The tribunal's failure confirmed that some investigations are too politically sensitive to succeed, that witnesses can be eliminated with impunity, and that international law enforcement has limited capacity to prosecute powerful states or their officials for war crimes. The revelation of Hobeika's double-agent status, which leaked gradually through intelligence channels in the years following his death, had complex ramifications for all parties involved. For Syrian intelligence, The disclosure that someone they believed they had successfully recruited and controlled for 15 years was actually serving Israeli interests throughout that period represented a catastrophic intelligence failure. The internal investigation that followed identified multiple warning signs that had been dismissed or rationalized away. The failure cost several Syrian intelligence officers their careers and led to comprehensive reorganization of their human intelligence operations. The lesson, brutally learned, was that assumptions about asset control based on political behavior and public positions could be dangerously wrong, and that even seemingly secure sources required continuous verification. For Hezbollah, the exposure was equally devastating but prompted more effective adaptation. Their internal security review, conducted with Iranian Revolutionary Guard assistance, identified dozens of compromised operations that could now be attributed to intelligence Hobeka provided. The pattern analysis revealed how Israeli operations had consistently targeted Hezbollah activities Hobeka knew about while missing operations he had no access to, providing circumstantial confirmation of his penetration. The security protocols Hezbollah implemented after 2002, including much more aggressive compartmentalization of information, routine polygraph testing of senior officials, and elaborate counter-surveillance procedures significantly reduced Israeli intelligence access to their planning. Some Israeli intelligence analysts privately credit Hezbollah's improved operational security after 2002 directly to lessons learned from the Hobeka penetration. For Israeli intelligence, the operation's end was professionally disappointing but operationally inevitable. 15 years of high-level penetration of Hezbollah and Syrian intelligence through a source positioned within Lebanese political establishment represented extraordinary success. The intelligence derived from Hobeka directly enabled dozens of successful military operations, prevented numerous attacks, and provided strategic insights into enemy thinking that shaped Israeli policy throughout the 1990s. His loss forced Mossad to rely more heavily on technical intelligence collection and lower-level human sources who lacked Hobeka's access to senior leadership decision-making. The operation also validated the strategy of recruiting double agents from visible public positions rather than focusing exclusively on clandestine sources, a lesson that has influenced subsequent intelligence recruitment priorities. Technology fails predictably and can be replaced, humans fail unpredictably and create cascading security disasters. The impact on Lebanese politics was muted, surprisingly. Hobeka's assassination was one among hundreds of political killings in Lebanon's violent modern history. His legacy remained contested. Christians who had supported Lebanese forces remembered him as defender of their community. Muslims and Palestinians remembered him as war criminal, and his parliamentary colleagues remembered him as pragmatic politician who navigated sectarian divisions. The revelation that he might have been an Israeli double agent, which leaked through intelligence channels in subsequent years, did not fundamentally alter these assessments. Those who hated him had another reason to hate him. Those who supported him dismissed the allegations as Syrian propaganda, and those who viewed him ambiguously found the double agent claims entirely consistent with his opportunistic political career. For Israel, the operation's success and eventual exposure created a template that has likely been replicated in variations since 2002. The fundamental insight that highly visible public figures can serve as effective intelligence sources if their cover role is crafted carefully enough has applications across numerous contexts. Politicians, businessmen, religious leaders, journalists, all can potentially function as intelligence sources, precisely because their public visibility seems inconsistent with covert intelligence work. The challenge is recruiting individuals in such positions who possess both access to valuable information and willingness to risk everything by cooperating with intelligence services. The Hobeka operation demonstrated that such individuals exist, that they can be recruited and managed effectively, and that the intelligence benefits justify the enormous operational costs. The operation also revealed limits of counterintelligence. Syrian Hezbollah and Lebanese intelligence services all failed to detect Hobeka's double agent status despite having access, motivation, and professional capabilities to do so. Their failure resulted not from incompetence but from cognitive bias. Assuming that someone as publicly visible and ideologically consistent as Hobeika appeared could not be hiding such profound deception. This suggests that even sophisticated intelligence services can be systematically fooled when operations are structured to exploit assumptions about how espionage works. The lesson for intelligence professionals is uncomfortable. You may be completely confident in your security assessments while being utterly wrong, and you will not know until catastrophic failure occurs. The story of how Mossad created a perfect illusion and lured enemies into trusting a double agent for 15 years is ultimately a story about human perception and the gap between appearance and reality. Eli Hobeika successfully convinced multiple intelligence services, political allies, and Lebanese public that he had transformed from Israeli-allied militia commander to Syrian-aligned Lebanese politician. The performance was so thorough, sustained over so many years with such consistency, that it became indistinguishable from reality for those observing from outside. Only 3 groups knew the truth: Hobeika himself, his Mossad handlers, and eventually whoever arranged his assassination. Everyone else lived inside the illusion, making decisions based on false understanding of who he was and where his loyalties lay. That gap between appearance and reality, sustained through discipline, patience, and operational sophistication, represents the essence of successful intelligence deception. The operation's ultimate failure, if it was indeed discovered before Hobeika's assassination, does not diminish the achievement of maintaining such an elaborate illusion for so long under conditions of intense scrutiny. It merely confirms that all deceptions eventually collapse, and that the question is never whether, but when. If this deep investigation into the mechanics of intelligence deception fascinated you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss when we expose the operations that shaped modern espionage. Drop a like if this analysis of tradecraft and human manipulation was worth your time. And here's your question for the comments. In intelligence operations, does the end of gathering critical information justify the means of elaborate deception and potential assassination of the source? Where should the ethical lines be drawn? Let's debate in the comments below.